It was a cold November 11, 2011, when 26-year-old David Roesler, an undergraduate studying industrial systems engineering at Virginia Tech, set out with two friends for a caving trip. Their destination was Stay High Cave, hidden off Clover Hollow Road in Giles County. Known in the caving community as a place demanding respect and caution, Stay High Cave isn't a spot for beginners. Navigating its hazardous passages requires at least a basic understanding of cave exploration, and attempting it without proper training can easily lead to disaster. Let's take a closer look at what makes this cave so tricky and why only those with prior experience should attempt to navigate it, as explained by John Bowling, president of Tech's Cave Club. Entering this cave requires staying high, keeping to the upper part of a narrow V-shaped passage to avoid the hazards below. At first glance, it seems like an ordinary cave. You can walk in without even needing to crouch. But after a few minutes, the space below waist level starts to narrow, shrinking to the point where the rock scrapes at your knees. Interestingly, the upper part of the passage remains wide enough to maneuver. This setup means you have to stay upright to make your way forward. It sounds simple enough, but here's the catch. The cave floor dips down, forming a deep, narrow crevice. To avoid this drop, you have to keep your feet on either side of the crack, inching forward carefully along the sides. One wrong step or slip, and you could tumble into the V-shaped crevice below. As John Bowling points out, every cave has its own set of rules. And the first rule of this one, known well within the caving community, is always stay close to the ceiling. However, for someone like David without training or any real caving experience, the crucial techniques for navigating such a cave were missed right from the start. David's lack of preparation soon became obvious. While he understood the basic rule of staying high, he underestimated the risks as he continued further into the cave. The passage was so narrow that only one person could pass at a time, leaving David's two friends waiting behind him. Unaware of the danger, David began slipping deeper into the V-shaped crevice below. Once your body gets trapped at an angle where you can't maneuver, the cave itself begins to work against you, like quicksand. Every move only pulls you in further. Gradually, David slid toward the narrowest part of the V-shaped passage. The slick walls offered no grip, and before he could react, he was sliding uncontrollably downward. His body plunged into the tightest part of the cave, where the rock walls closed in around him, squeezing him into a space so tight that even breathing became a struggle. Eventually, David reached the narrowest part of the passage and finally came to a stop, painfully wedged between the rocks. Panic set in immediately. His arms were pinned tightly against his sides, and every attempt to free himself only made things worse. The jagged rocks dug into his skin, and the crushing pressure on his chest made each breath a struggle. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, sending fresh waves of searing pain through his body. It felt as though the cave itself was squeezing the life out of him, and no matter how hard he tried to push himself up or twist free, the unyielding rock wouldn't budge. His friends heard his desperate shouts, yelling that he couldn't move in any direction. Not fully realizing the seriousness of the situation, they shouted back instructions, urging him to keep pushing himself back toward the entrance. But minutes turned into hours as David's body remained trapped, immobile. When his friends began to panic, they knew they needed to run for help. Meanwhile, David's pain was growing unbearable. The lack of blood flow to his trapped leg caused it to swell painfully. Every slight movement sent jolts of agony shooting up his leg and into his lower back as the unyielding rock pressed deeper into his body. His muscles ached from the strain, and the cold seeping through the cave walls turned his pain into a bone-chilling ache. At first, frustration fueled his determination, giving him hope that he could somehow free himself. But gradually, his frustration turned to helplessness. His strength waned, and his breathing grew labored, not only from the tightness of the space, but from the creeping realization that he might not make it out alive. When the Newport Rescue Squad arrived, they immediately grasped the severity of the situation. David wasn't just stuck, he was being crushed by the cave itself. Despite their best efforts to pull him out, every attempt only worsened his condition. He was wedged so tightly that freeing him risked further injury. As the hours dragged on and the temperature continued to drop, desperation began to mount. David's body was failing him. His leg, twisted and crushed under his own weight, began to go numb. At first, the numbness felt like a relief, a dull throb replacing the sharp pain. But as it spread, the rescue team realized they were facing a double threat. Not only was hypothermia setting in, but also a dangerous condition called compartment syndrome. This occurs when pressure builds up in a limb, restricting blood flow and causing tissue death. Determined, the rescue teams worked tirelessly, chipping away at the rock to widen the passage. They brought in electric air hammers, cutting into the walls at multiple points. The work was painstakingly slow, requiring constant adjustments in technique and an inch-by-inch effort to move him upward. John Bowling later recounted that the rescue team initially thought they were just 5 minutes from getting David out. But as the ordeal dragged on, they reached a point where they considered whether it would even be possible without taking the drastic measure of breaking his hips just to maneuver him free from the crushing gap. David's leg was a constant source of agony, twisted at an unnatural angle, and every slight shift sent waves of unbearable pain coursing through him. The cold was taking its toll as well. Concerned about how much longer he could endure, rescuers worked tirelessly, stuffing heat packs into his clothing and using a hairdryer to blow warm air onto his body. Yet despite their efforts, the frigid air gnawed at David's limbs, and his strength was fading rapidly. As David neared the cave entrance, he became stuck several more times, each time forcing the team to repeat the slow and grueling process of extraction. The frustration and exhaustion grew as rescuers looked down to find they'd only moved him a few feet, despite hours of effort. Still, everyone kept their composure, knowing that frustration wouldn't help anyone. The rescue team tried to hide their exhaustion from David, aware that he would panic even more if he sensed their weariness. One rescuer later commented that it's part of their job to keep the victim calm, no matter how desperate the situation. You always assure them that everything's going according to plan, even when it's not. As the night wore on, David's world dissolved into a haze of cold and pain. His body was too exhausted to keep fighting, and he began slipping in and out of consciousness, overcome by pain and exhaustion. Yet the rescuers never gave up. They continued chipping away at the bedrock around him, hoisting his broken body upward inch by inch. Finally, after nearly 12 grueling hours, David was freed. Limp and pale from the cold, he was carefully pulled from the cave, his leg severely injured. He was immediately flown to Montgomery Regional Hospital, where doctors treated his hypothermia and the devastating crush injury that had nearly cost him his leg. David later shared that the incident had lasting effects, not only on his physical health, but also on his mental well-being. David's life hung by a thread, and the pain he experienced was beyond anything most of us could ever imagine. For more in-depth stories like this one, be sure to explore our channel.